Start in just a few seconds. Okay, I will call this meeting to order. And we'll begin with introductions. I'm Dan Watson. I'm the chair of the commission. And we'll start on my left.
I'm Paula Silsby. I'm a former federal prosecutor.
Hi, I'm Dr. Anthony Ingham, a psychiatrist in Bengal.
I'm Toby Dilworth. I'm a lawyer in Portland. Jeff Rushlow, former district attorney and former judge.
Debbie Bader, retired forensic psychologist.
And the staff can introduce themselves.
Jim Osterreiter. I'm a retired FBI supervisor for the state of Maine and an investigator for a law firm in Portland for 18 years.
I'm Brian McMaster, investigator from commission, retired chief investigator for the attorney general.
I'm Ann Jordan, the executive director of the commission.
Before I turn to the Maine State Police today, I'd like to say just a word about the time frame for the work of the commission, which has been asked of me several times. We will be scheduling additional hearings, and we have one scheduled for March 7th. Some of the additional hearings, we recently, within the last several days, made arrangements for the use of the city council chambers in Lewiston. And so some of those proceedings will be scheduled there. They have live stream and split screen, which is what we have to have in order to conduct the hearing. So I also want to say that the commission will attempt to present a public interim report not later than April 1, dealing with issues relevant to policy matters that may be under consideration by Governor Mills and the legislature. The balance of our report will follow in due course thereafter. I can't give details as to what will be included in one or the other. The matter is still fluid. We have no idea what we'll hear today and in future days, but that's the timeline that we've established. So with that, I will turn to the Maine State Police and call upon Colonel Ross. And I want to say that we appreciate the cooperation that we've received from Maine State Police. Thus far, the investigative files have been made available to us, which are, I saw somewhere that there's a tetrabyte or a terabyte of information. I know there's a lot of material. That's all I know. So we appreciate it took a little longer than I anticipated, but I can see why. And so we're happy to have you. So Colonel Ross, we will call upon you. I understand that you folks are prepared to proceed with sort of a briefing of, if you will, of various activities. And we will have questions as you go along. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for any questions that remain. There are a number of people who I will call upon that I understand are prepared to testify to or speak to several of these matters. And then I have a list of people who are here from the Maine State Police who are available for questions if that's necessary at the conclusion. So does that meet with your understanding?
I'm here to follow your lead, sir. Whatever you ask,
Oh, good.
whoever you need, we'll get them.
Good.
So, yes, absolutely.
I hope I can lead. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chair Wathen, Commission members. My name is Bill Ross and I'm the Colonel of the Maine State Police. We're here today to answer questions about the mass shooting which occurred in Lewiston on October 25th of last year. We're here to answer questions about the decisions made and actions taken by the state police throughout that incident. The answers we provide to your questions, along with the large volume of reports, investigative material we have received and made available to the commission, are to provide the facts so you thoroughly understand what law enforcement did prior, during, and after October 25th tragedy. The answers to these questions are important for the citizens of Maine, the Lewiston community, victims, survivors, and their families. We are here to provide them with answers about what happened on October 25th and the following manhunt for the perpetrator responsible for these senseless acts, so they can form their own opinion of the actions of their law enforcement agencies. This massive undertaking involving hundreds of federal, state, county, and local law enforcement agencies working together with fire, rescue, and our area hospitals. The NESPAC, which is the New England State Police Administrators Compact, was initiated, and resources from several other state police partners were sent up to help. The state police and the greater law enforcement community are committed to working with the commission so they can determine the facts and provide recommendations for improvement. The manhunt for the perpetrator lasted approximately 48 hours before his body was located, and no one was injured or killed after the police response on October 25th. As law enforcement leaders, we can identify the things that went well, what we need improvement on, but to listen to the recommendations to the commission is essential for progress. There was significant challenge with self-deployment to the incident, self-dispatching, and leaks of information. These are recurring issues that throughout the country during these types of incidents, these challenges were met with solutions through leadership and implementing the incident command system. To sit before you today to answer your questions and have made my command staff here available and several of the key decision makers from the state police who responded to the mass shooting and subsequent manhunt and criminal investigation and various other services that we made available. The state police were the lead law enforcement agency for the criminal investigation and crime scenes, the manhunt, family services, and other specialized assets. Although we were the lead agency, we could not have done this without our law enforcement partnerships, all sharing the same goal of locating the person responsible for killing 18 people and injuring 13 others. The weight on our shoulders to find Robert Card was immense and became heavier with every minute that passed. This was a difficult time for all involved. The state police personnel here today, not only in front of you, but in the audience, were present during the investigation and manhunt, are prepared to answer your questions. These individuals have my confidence and hold positions in the state police because of their proven abilities to make decisions, manage stressful incidents, and keep those around them safe, be relying on their training, experience, and their ability to assess risk. With me here today is the state police command staff, Lieutenant Colonel Bryant Scott, who handles personnel issues, policies, and runs our Office of Professional Standards. Major Hare runs our operations, which is our patrol, our training unit, and our specialty teams. Major Gosselin here to my left runs our support services and our major crimes unit. Also with me here today is Sergeant Roy and Lieutenant Stevenson. Sergeant Roy is our tactical team commander. Lieutenant Stevenson is our specialty teams commander. Sergeant Farley and Lieutenant Keating are in our major crimes unit south. They were the lead investigative body for any crimes that occurred in Lewiston, to include this mass shooting. Lieutenant Pickering in here, he has also been the liaison to the commission with getting the maximum amount of reports over to them. Lieutenant Mitchell and Lieutenant Crane are from Major Crimes North. They came down to assist in various capacities, but particularly with victim services. Sergeant Bryant and Sergeant Rose were in charge of the crime scenes, the multiple crime scenes that we had that day. We also have available Chief Pilot Greg Torado and our dive team commander, Jared Stedman, in the event that you have any questions of those types of assets. Sergeant Pappas is here, who's one of our turnpike supervisors. Also with us today is Commissioner Sawchuk and Public Information Officer Shannon Moss from the Department of Public Safety. I can answer questions now or however you'd like to proceed.
I think I've been supplied with a list, which I suspect came from you folks. And I'll call upon those in the order that I have them, and they can provide us with what information we have, and we'll ask questions, and we may come back to you at any point or at the conclusion
Yes, sir.
You're still here, so I assume you will be.
I will be.
Okay. Sure.
Colonel Ross, has your agency conducted a critical incident review of this matter?
We have done several reviews in certain aspects. For instance, our tactical team has done a review of their actions. We've done a command level review at a commanding officers meeting. We've had several after actions for wellness, and our member assistance team is a part of the state police. It's a specialized unit that comes out, pulls people together, and kind of rehashes the events. We're also waiting to see what the commission comes out with before we come up with any formalized changes. We thought that it would be sure for us to come to any findings, certainly without the commission moving forward. But we have talked extensively about what we did during those 3 days, what we could do better. And it is something that was necessary to implement. We would have done that already.
So what you have done so far, you consider a critical incident review?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And in doing that, have you relied on any resources external to the Maine State Police?
We have.
And who is that?
We relied on the Pennsylvania State Police to do our tactical team review. And we have relied on other member assistance programs for the wellness portion of it with respect to how this has affected our law enforcement community, how it's affected our troopers, deputies, and local law enforcement. But in terms of a overall overarching critical incident review, we have not brought in an outside party to do this.
Are there any plans to do so?
Yes, we will be doing that.
And have you identified who that will be?
We have not at this time.
And what will you be looking for when you undertake that search?
We'll be looking for someone that has a similar type agency and that has responded, or has a team that has responded to similar type incidents, and be able to provide us with areas where we need improvements, areas where we did well. We also want the commission's work to come forward too, so we can put those things together. I don't want to be making changes that contradict something that the commission puts out. We know some of the things that we could do better on, and we'll make those improvements. But from an overall review of the agency, I want to make sure that those things are happening together.
Is it your understanding that this incident is unique in the country's unfortunate history of mass shootings?
It is unique, yes.
And what, in your opinion, makes it unique?
I think right out of the gate, you have 2 incidents, 2 shootings. Typically, the active shooter is captured on scene, or there's an officer involved shooting, they're deceased on scene, or they take their own life. The fact that there's 2 scenes and there's this extensive manhunt is a kind of a combination of some horrific things that have happened across the country. Certainly the things that I've researched and looked at and been exposed to in trainings. I think that's what makes this unique. There isn't a kind of a boilerplate. This is what's happened before. This is extremely unique and was extremely challenging for us to go through. I think will be extremely challenging for us to have some type of rapid reaction.
And is the investigation in this matter continuing?
We are still bringing in reports, but in terms of the criminal investigation, right now, the criminal investigation has ended.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here, all of you. We really do appreciate it. My question pertains to, just out of my own naivete about this thing, kind of review. But as part of your review, do you look at how the local law enforcement, Maine State Police, and federal agencies kind of work together? What worked, what didn't work, how, who was taking the lead, those sorts of issues?
I think that'll be the biggest part of it. In terms of who takes the lead, depends on what type of incident that it is, and those are pretty clear lines. There are clear lines that could change at a moment's notice with the discovery of any piece of information or evidence. For instance, we handle all the homicide investigations in the state of Maine with the exception of Bangor and Portland. So if we go to Lewiston, we're handling the homicide investigation, whether it's 1 or 18 people like it was in this tragedy. If say the FBI is on scene, they'll work with us, they'll bring assets in. But if this makes a turn where there's some type of terrorism or some other type of thing that becomes a federal crime that will trump what we're doing, then we'll just switch positions and we will take on a support role to their lead.
Do you imagine that the ultimate review, whenever that's concluded, will highlight in this particular instance how well various entities work together? You know, it was a large number of people from what I understand. I mean, we talked to, as you probably know, the Lewiston PD and Lisbon PD last week. And I think they talked about 400 or so law enforcement kind of converging on Lewiston PD in the time immediately following the first reports. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then there's, federal law enforcement, FBI and such that come in. Do you see that as being part, sort of figuring out how to deal with that kind of massive personnel, with various lines of
I think the incident command system helps to take the chaos of the first response, which, bringing those resources and bringing that massive amount of law enforcement into Lewiston during the active shooter, even though chaotic, is absolutely necessary to saturate that area and to make sure that we're available to respond to potentially a third or a fourth location. I think as the active shooter moves and hours go by, order needs to take place. And this is where the incident command system with Major Gosselin we'll be talking about in a little bit starts to take that large event, which is chaotic and now needs more structure because there's no longer an active shooter. You're now looking for the person involved in the active shooting. That needs to go into this ICS process, which we've done probably for the last 15 plus years with our incident management assistance team, which Major Gosselin was one of the founding members of. It works when you see it in motion. It makes sense. And getting everybody to buy into that is important. People have different levels of training, different levels of experience or exposure with this. And it's kind of the conception versus the practice. We practice it a lot, and you see it a lot with federal partners. They do it as well. But it's something we have used, and we've had similar situations in the past, manhunts. I believe the Gene Cole murder, Somerset County deputy that was murdered comes to mind. That lasted several days in a manhunt, but ICS was deployed on that, and it took a very chaotic scene and transformed it into something that was much more organized, much more controlled.
As far as the critical review that the tactical team did that produce a report?
Not as of yet, that's still pending.
So there will be a report?
There will be a report, yes.
We have access to that?
You will have access to that, yes.
And as far as the unique nature of the shooting, is it also a factor that Maine is a state that has you as the statewide jurisdiction on almost all homicides?
Yes, sir.
Is that followed across the country elsewhere? And a single entity has jurisdiction over most homicides?
I think when you talk about the entire country, it's that's really wide open. There's some, most large cities will conduct their own homicide investigations. Right. Some agencies utilize the state police primarily, like Massachusetts might, and Vermont might. And then there's other areas of the country that would rely on county government and county law enforcement to handle homicide investigations. So it's really all over the place.
So in terms of Maine experience, I know the Eugene Cole matter was a single homicide scene. The manhunt was much broader than that.
Yes, it was.
And here you have two huge scenes plus a man.
Yes, sir.
So exponentially larger issues.
Considerably more issues, considerably more challenges.
Thank you.
Okay, and nothing further at this point. I'll call on the first person's name that I have been given, Sergeant Thomas Pappas. See. You may proceed.
Good morning.
We have no questions because we not sure what you want to say. So why don't you just proceed and tell us what you understand you were called upon for this morning?
So start with an introduction and how much years of service and so on.
Absolutely. So my name is Thomas Pappas. I've been a law enforcement officer since 2006. I graduated the basic law enforcement training program for the Portland Police Department. In 2008, I joined the Maine State Police and was assigned to Troop B, which is Androscoggin, Cumberland, and Oxford counties. In 2012, I was assigned to the Maine Drug Enforcement Agency and eventually went into the federal DEA. In 2016, I was promoted to sergeant and fully assigned to the Maine Turnpike, where I have been since in 2017 to the present.
What can you tell us about this incident?
Sure. So on September 16th, 2023, a date that I have recollected by process of elimination, I was driving in the town of Bowdoin, specifically on the West Road. During that time, sometime between 10 and noon, and again, this is just a rough estimate, I observed a Saginaw County Sheriff's deputy's car on the side of the road facing north on the west road. The vehicle was, I believe, running, but the lights were not on it, the emergency lights. So I stopped to see what the deputy was doing. I stopped in the middle of the West Road, and at the time I didn't know the deputy's name. He's actually Sergeant Schofield. Came to the passenger side window of my car, and I had asked him what he was doing. He had pointed to a residence on the West Road and informed me that the person that resided in that residence had threatened to shoot up the Saco Armory. From there, I asked him what his next step would be, potentially calling specialty teams, search warrants, surrounding callouts, and possible perimeter setup. At the inception of it, just the two of us, and he said he was not going to go too far. As we continue that conversation, he stated that the people that the threats were made against not believe it, that was going to happen, and he was going to go knock on the door. At that point in time, based on where we were, what he had told me, I decided that was not a good idea, and told him that. He responded by telling me, and this is not a quote, but I wasn't called there for my opinion. I left there after telling him that I'd be somewhat available, or any trooper would be available to him, and returned back to my area of operation, which is the Maine Turnpike. For everybody's knowledge, it's on 95, the portion from Kittery to Augusta.
Let me ask you, were you called there or you just happened to be there?
It's by happenstance, sir. Okay. Yes, sir.
But essentially he said something to the effect that you weren't called there for your opinion as to how to handle it.
Correct.
I'm the chairman of the Maine Turnpike Authority, so I wondered why you're out of the
We occasionally have to get off, sir.
Okay, I'll forget that. All right. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Jeff.
Had you ever met Sergeant Schofield before that day?
I have not. I didn't know his name until after 10:25, and then process of elimination, news, reading reports. That's when I found out who it actually was.
Yeah, I may have missed a little bit of what you said because the door closed or opened or something like that, but he basically told you that the people who reported the threat didn't really feel it was all that serious.
Correct. They didn't believe that it was going to happen.
But what was it you said didn't sound like a good idea?
It was the knocking on the door.
Knocking on the door was not a good idea.
Correct.
because of the danger to the officer or something
Just
escalated.
the limited information that I knew at the time, that the gentleman that was residing in a trailer that he had pointed to, and the potential offense with weapons, I didn't think knocking on the door was a good idea.
Thank you.
Sure.
Did you make any suggestions? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I didn't see.
Did you make suggestions to him?
I didn't make suggestions, but what I basically said is, what do you want to do for a next step? And that's when I said, is there a tactical team coming? Do you want to set up a half-cock perimeter with the two of us, which we could do at the inception of these incidents? So I made those well, not even a recommendation. I just told them that, and there was no response other than I wasn't called to hear from my opinion.
Excuse me, go ahead.
Have you seen the report prepared by Michael Cunningham?
I did.
Did you read the section on page 34 regarding your interaction with Sergeant Schofield?
I did.
It says that you informed Sergeant Schofield that you believed that Sergeant Schofield's response to mental health concerns was sufficient under the circumstances. Is that how you would characterize your conversation with Sergeant Schofield?
No.
How would you?
I had less than a minute conversation with him. What I just told the commission. And based on the conversation that I had with him, with the limited information I had about a potential crime, that was it.
Deborah Bader, you may have a question.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Did he, in that brief interaction, share that he was there specifically for a welfare check?
I don't ever believe we talked about a welfare check.
Okay. Or anything around, sort of a yellow flag, protective custody issue? Did he mention anything along those lines?
The conversation didn't go
Didn't
that.
go that far. And did you subsequently learn in sort of this case as you followed it, any other information about, for example, the lengths that the SACO unit took with respect to the threats?
I subsequently learned everything after 10:25, just watching the news and reading articles like the general public does.
Thank you.
Did Mr. Cunningham ever speak to you?
Just hang on just a second. Let's go a bit where.
So again, recap, it sounds like it was a very quick interaction that you had, right, for like a minute, two max.
Yes.
Okay, and again, you know, you and he were possessing different information, but based on what you heard, did you feel the level of concern was like, would you raise your eyebrows versus what he was doing? I mean, was there any difference in how you were?
I had limited information to act on. Obviously, we take anybody that threatens to shoot people.
Yeah.
Serious. But I couldn't come to a guaranteed conclusion based on the information that I knew at the time.
But is it enough for you to say it's not a good idea to knock on the door?
Absolutely. I mean, anybody that's threatening harm against themselves or others, we wouldn't take the steps to knock on the door.
So if you were, again, I'm putting what if situation here. Sounds like you probably take a next step to just kind of identify the threat more. Is that a presumptive statement on my part or?
I can't say, doctor, what I would do at the time based on the information that I had at that time. It's very hard.
Okay.
I didn't know if a crime was committed. I knew nothing about mental illness.
Okay.
Nothing at that time, so it's very hard for me to, I can't answer.
Again, just to say clear that you were concerned at least not to go near the door.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, excuse me, I shouldn't call you by your first name. Mr. Rushlow is next.
Did Mr. Cunningham, the one who, man who wrote the report, ever speak to you?
Not about this incident, no.
Thank you.
Sergeant, I take it that you were not familiar with the file 6 on Mr. Card at that time?
I was not.
And was it your opinion based on what limited information you received from Sergeant Schofield that a crime had been committed?
I didn't come to that conclusion because I didn't have enough information.
This moment.
It's a really quick question.
Sure.
with respect to the file 6, is that something that's like, if you're in your vehicle, is there a way to sort of see if Robert Card's name was associated with the file 6 at that time? I just don't know how these kind of, what's on.
I'll try to answer your question in depth. So these files, depending on what agency, come across different ways. Sometimes they're broadcasted by dispatch centers. And sometimes they're just sent to our mobile data terminal, which is a technical term for a computer. And the files that come across are not just file 6s. There's many different files. So these files come across in different messages. So it depends on what area you're working is what you're paying attention to. For instance, I work 95 on the Maine Turnpike. So a lot of times those files, as they come across, the heading might be Attention Maine Turnpike Authority. So I don't review every file because I checked this morning, since November, there's been almost, I believe it was 2,000. And that's not just file 6s, that's every file. So as they come across, I don't check every file. Just to clarify, I couldn't put in Robert Card and search for a file, correct? If that's what you're asking.
That sort of was my question.
Yes, if I ran Robert Card's name, he would come back as a file 6. But if I'm searching through these files, he wouldn't come up. There's no way to search the actual file, at least in my computer.
One quick question. One of the statement that was made in Seneca County was that the sergeant had called for backup from a neighboring community, and he thought you were that backup. So did it come across? And when you left, like I'm just waiting for someone else to back me up here. Was there anything like that?
That's what I thought after the incident actually happened and kind of figured out why the conversation went the way it did. I subsequently found out afterwards that he didn't call for the Maine State Police. He called for another deputy in a neighboring county. And that afterwards, I figured out that that's why the conversation happened the way it did.
Thank you.
Did the name Robert Card ever come up in your conversation with the sergeant?
No,
So when you were putting all this together after the 25th of October, you had to sort of connect some dots there to figure out West Road, Bowden, Robert Card, deputy in there in September.
yes. It was very simple to
Yeah.
connect the dots. I connected the dots later that night on 10/25.
No further questions. Thank you very much, Sergeant Pappas.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you.
The name on the list I've been provided, Major Lucas Hare. You could begin by introducing yourself, although I guess the colonel already introduced you, so forget that.
Well, I think just a little background, sir, if you will. Thank you for having us and having me here. My name is Lucas Hare. I'm currently the operations major for the state police. The colonel did explain my responsibilities. I have been a police officer since 1999. I started with the South Portland Police Department. I have been with the state police since 2003. During that time frame, I spent 10 years in our major crimes unit as a detective and also as a detective sergeant. I also spent 10 years on our tactical team, and 4 of those years I was one of the assistant commanders. So as my role in the operations, as the operations major, the colonel explained that, but I was contacted fairly early on the night of October 25th. I don't live far from Lewiston, and having been a detective and a detective sergeant and spending most of my career in this area, I've worked with Lewiston PD for a number of years. That area, Androscoggin County and District 3 was my area as a detective sergeant. So I'm familiar with it, probably as much as any law enforcement officer that doesn't work for Lewiston PD. On October 25th, I received a first phone call at 7:14 reporting to me that there had been a mass shooting or that there was an active shooter currently going on in the city of Lewiston. Since that was the first call, my first thought was to call our dispatch center. And when I did call them, I was quite surprised because I asked the caller, and again, we are, though the biggest agency in Maine, we're a small agency. The dispatcher knew my voice before I even said who I was. And I just said, are we getting, or has the RCC, our Regional Communications Center?
Excuse me.
Oh, no problem, sir.
Go right ahead.
Okay. Have we received any calls of an active shooter or a mass shooting in the city of Lewiston? I was quite surprised. Our dispatcher is a professional, but she was so calm when she described the situation and what was occurring. It almost took a minute to register. So once that had been confirmed, I immediately left my house, and within 3 minutes, I was on my way to Lewiston. Prior to leaving the driveway, I made a few requests. I contacted Lieutenant Ray Keaton, made sure that our major crimes unit, our detectives were on the way, which they were. I then contacted Lieutenant Stevenson to make sure that our tactical team and our crisis negotiation team was also responding, which they were. And I also requested that our incident management assistant team begin to respond. And that is the team that implements ICS for us. They build that framework for which we work out of. The reason I requested our IMAT team very early on is learning from previous after action reports. It's a mistake I've made. I've waited too long to activate that group and have them respond. And I knew instantly receiving the reports that we had that this was going to be a multi-day operation and that we would be there for longer than a single day or single operational period, depending on how you build out the ICS structure. And when I'm done, or at some point, Major Gosselin is going to come up next and speak about ICS and its implementation. But I'll talk about how it was initially started. When I started to respond, I had my radio on and I could hear state police personnel going to various areas within Lewiston. And I identified one of those people as Sergeant Duda. I could hear him on the radio. So I called him and I asked him to go to the Lewiston Police Department to begin setting up a command post and organizing the state police response, but also helping to organize other tasks that I'm sure needed to be done at that point at the police department. By 7:42, I had arrived at the police department. I've been to that police department a number of times at night for homicide or other investigations. This was different than any other time I've been there. The roads were packed with cruisers. Every parking spot, with very few exceptions, was full. When I went to the police entrance, which is at the rear of the building, that Sallyport area was full of officers. It was a level of emotion varying across the spectrum that I have not seen in my police career. Made my way through the back door, instantly recognizing people, first responders, people that I've worked with, and I made my way to the shift commander's desk, which is right there on the first floor. Immediately noticed how many people were there. I was continually having to excuse myself to kind of wedge my way through officers who were filling that hallway and the stairway, which goes to the second floor. I made my way to the shift commander's office and could hear various assignments being made, officers responding throughout the town. And Deputy Chief Higgins was there. I've known him, dealt with him on prior investigations. We had a brief conversation and when we both decided that we needed to set up a command post, that for the time being, the Lewiston Police Department was the best area to do that, as we already had a number of resources there. And I asked if we could use the classroom upstairs, which is, it's an area we've used for briefings before. It's relatively big, probably a little smaller than this room, but in the past, it had been enough, big enough for us to use. So we started going up there. As I was walking up the stairs, we heard a call come in of Da Vinci's, that there was an active shooter or possibly a gunman at Da Vinci's restaurant. You have to commend our first responders for this. Within minutes, that had been investigated and we were known that it was a false report. There in fact was not anyone there shooting. And so we continued on into the shift command post at that point, and we started to try to get some things organized. Shortly thereafter, as we were setting up, the commissioner arrived. He and I had a brief conversation about tasks and about what we were doing. And then shortly after that, Lieutenant Aaron Turcott arrived. When I saw Lieutenant Turcott, I asked him if he would go to Schmenge's, as I had been briefed that that was one of the two scenes. And the purpose of that is to begin taking some control and responsibility for the investigation and preserving the scenes and making sure that we have good communication both with the Lewiston PD and the other agencies that are there. By having the lieutenant there, I have a direct line of communication to him at all times. Knowing that he was there and within a few minutes, I was aware at 11 minutes past 8 or 8:11 that we had another report of another active shooter at the Walmart distribution center. So again, I've worked in this area. I know how big that structure is. It's massive. And I know from my experience on the tactical team, in 2013, I was certified by the National Tactical Officers Association as an instructor for response to active shooter. I know, or I have a good idea of the tactics and the amount of people it's going to take to clear that, but also how fast we need them there if there is a risk to the public and if there is another active shooter. And we could immediately hear over the radio people responding, which is exactly what we needed. I had spoken to Lieutenant Kevin Burton at that point. He is the commander of the Southern Field Troop for the state police. And I asked him to respond to that distribution center again for to provide some state police input, but also to have control over some of our people and to help organize. This at this point is very much a collaborative effort between all of the police departments there, and it needs to be. So having another representative there, again, it helps us instill some control and hopefully preserve to help save lives first and foremost, but to also help preserve any evidence that we may need for future prosecution. We fairly quickly, for a structure that size, learned that, again, this was a false report and then there was not anyone there shooting. But I also became aware of, at some point during that search, again, it's a huge structure, that two groups of law enforcement had come into contact. And during that initial contact, there was some confusion as to who was law enforcement and who was not. And this raised a flag for me and for others in the command post. If you look at previous interactions and you look at some of the lessons that not only we as the state police, but other agencies have learned, and in this case, I'll point to the marathon bombing in Boston, you'll see that some friendly fire or blue on blue had happened in there. And this was a concern for us initially that night. We have anywhere from, I've heard estimates, 400 law enforcement officers in the area responding to calls. We needed them to do that, but we also needed to mitigate that risk both to the public and to law enforcement as best we could. It's my job as someone in that scene to mitigate that risk. I'm never going to eliminate it. And there are times where we asked and our law enforcement first responders did put their safety above that of, or put the public safety, put themselves ahead or put the public safety first, apologize. So that, I mean, you saw that in Da Vinci's, you saw that at both of the initial scenes. So first responders went in and did exactly what they've been trained to do and what they should have done when responding to an active shooter. So as this kind of continued, at this point, it was shortly after 8 o'clock, we learned that first responders had been able to obtain photos from the video surveillance system of the suspect and his vehicle. There was a very brief discussion as those photos made their way to the command post, and it was very quickly determined, put them out by any means we can. News, social media, the Lewiston PD social media, the sheriff's department's social media, no one cared at that point. We need to get this out so all of law enforcement sees it and the public has it as well. And that went out fairly quickly. At about 8:35, we were advised by Auburn PD of a suspect, and that was developed by the photographs. And looking at the photographs that we had and comparing them to known people within those communities that law enforcement had dealt with, Auburn PD quickly identified someone that they wanted to make contact with. And they did that relatively quickly, made contact, they surrounded a building, they called this person out. Though this person had an uncanny likeness, he was not involved. So we were able to rule that out. But these are the things now that are coming into that command post. We are receiving hundreds of calls. People are calling, and those we are filtering through those and trying to prioritize what we need a response to. Obviously, anything with a direct link to public safety is the priority. At that point, we have two objectives. We need to stop the killing and we need to find the person responsible for it. And though an oversimplification, that is the focus, especially during that initial response. At about 8:50, Lieutenant Aaron Hayden from the state police arrived, and I asked him to go to just in time and act as the officer in charge for the state police at that scene. Again, preserving evidence, working with our partners to make sure that it's safe and to make sure that we have control of those scenes for future evidence and processing. Not long after that, because of the photos that we were able to get, we were able to put out a bolo attempting with a vehicle that Robert Carr was driving. One of the photos showed a white Subaru. And it wasn't long after that, we'd also were contacted, law enforcement was contacted and given the name of Robert Carr as a suspect. Things happened very quickly once he was identified. A DMV query showed that he did have a vehicle that matched the description in one of the photos as being his vehicle. And so now that name is starting to circulate and it started to go out.
Can I just ask, was it a family member who identified it?
It was. We also received other phone calls, but my understanding was it was, yes. Once that happens, the things develop relatively quickly. The bolo goes out. We now know that, or we believe that vehicle was his, the white Subaru. We're able to do a DMV query. And when I say we, I mean the collective we. People in the room were doing this. I don't mean to take credit for it. That was not the case. I did not do this work. And we were also able to obtain a phone number for him. And one of our detectives within minutes was able to work with a cellular company and find out where that phone was. And a lot of information really started to develop quickly. At about 10 o'clock, I spoke to Major Gosselin on the phone. He was in the area. And we had attempted to set up a staging area because at this point we had so many law enforcement personnel responding. There just was no longer room at the police department. You couldn't park around it. You couldn't get in and out of it. So someone mentioned that the Coliseum parking lot in Lewiston would be a great area to help stage. It's large. It's at that point defensible because none of us knew where that suspect may be. And we started to try to organize that area by a sign-in sheet, trying to find out who was there so that we were accountable for them, but also what they might have for resources so that we knew planning ahead if we needed a group to do a search or if we needed a certain skill set, what we might have there available to us. Within minutes of establishing or attempting to establish this at 10:08, Robert Carr's vehicle was located at the boat launch in Livermore. So a few things come into play now. We've talked about the first responders, and you've heard me. We're starting to set up ICS at this point, but it's very important in the response to an active shooter that we also practice decentralized command. And what that means is simply this, is those officers in the field know their job. They know what they're supposed to do. We've talked about the two objectives. That was very clear, and I don't think it's something that, at least from what I saw that night, even needed to be discussed. When they had a report of an active shooter or the public being in danger, they responded immediately. That's what we need them to do in those instances. However, at some point, the tactics need to shift slightly. We need to become much more deliberate in our movements and our searches. If we don't have actionable intelligence or a sighting of someone calling and saying he's in a house here, we need to start to slow things down and be more deliberate in our searches. We do that so that we don't miss things. We do that so that once an area is searched, we're comfortable that it's been searched. And I think Sergeant Roy, who is our tactical team leader, and Lieutenant Stevenson are going to come after me at some point today. They can touch on a lot of that as well. But my job, or one of them being in the command post, is now at this point to slow things down. Can that change in an instant? Yes, it can. If another call came in that another shooting was taking place or there was information directly relating to his location, then first responders would respond to that and they would protect the public. And that's what we want them to do. When we learned of the vehicle being parked, one of you asked earlier, I apologize, was this Maine mass shooting similar to others in the country? There's only one that I'm familiar with that is remotely similar to this, and it's the San Bernardino shooting that took place in California. What is similar is that you have a mass shooting where the person is not relatively quickly taken into custody. I think Maine's differs, at least in what I'm aware of, because you had two shooting scenes with a very high casualty rate at both, but then you have no law enforcement contact. The person is gone. I'm sure you were all aware and you saw how fast first responders were at each scene. That is striking that that person is gone already. So immediately we have to think, what is the strategy here? What are they doing? Do they have other things planned? And when we located that vehicle, Lieutenant Master Cassavant was in the command post. He was able to pull up a Google Earth image and just show me briefly. It immediately made me think that there was a possibility of an ambush. And a couple reasons. One, this person has been to 2 venues and completed mass shootings and fled successfully with no contact with law enforcement. But we also now have the vehicle parked, so it's plainly visible from Route 196 by anyone that's passing by. And once the evidence of that is, once law enforcement had a description of it, they found that vehicle very quickly. And what is the purpose of parking that vehicle there, plainly visible? And some of you may be familiar. This is something that I've was brought to my attention through our partners at NESPAC, was the Draga shooting in New Hampshire, which was in Colebrook, New Hampshire. Those of you that are familiar, I'll very briefly touch on it. In August of '97 in Colebrook, New Hampshire, Draga killed 4 people. He killed 2 troopers, a judge, and a reporter in this small town. He then fled. He stole a police car and he fled from that scene. He was involved in another shooting. And one of the tactics that's been relayed to me, he set up an ambush. He parked that cruiser, so it was on a logging road, but it was visible from the paved road so that first responders or people would see it. And as they saw it, a team of law enforcement using a K9 tracked to that vehicle. He took a position of advantage over them, waited for them to get on that trail, and then he shot 3 of them. This almost immediately, this is something that because it's so close to home along, the Boston Marathon bombing, combined with this being right in Colebrook, New Hampshire, combined with us training with our NESPAC partners. So I've trained with other members of New Hampshire, Vermont, Mass, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, their police departments, but also with their SWAT teams. This is something that has really been discussed a lot amongst that group. And that was my immediate thought, was this is an ambush of some nature. We also knew at that point that Robert Card was a member of the military. And the information we had was that he had at least one rifle that potentially someone had given us a description of it and said that they believed he also had a thermal scope on that rifle. So that gives him the ability for in my layman's terms, to see in the dark. Looking at the area where that vehicle was, that was something that immediately raised a concern to me. So for a number of reasons, I asked over the radio for it to be broadcast that no one approached that vehicle. We needed to maintain a perimeter, but we also needed to make sure that we're preserving any evidence that may be there. So I asked that any first responders that were there or responding, please to maintain a safe distance and set up a perimeter around it. And that was done over the radio. I know that was not a popular decision. You have to understand that the only way I can describe it is our law enforcement partners, the people that were there that night, this is their community, and they were desperate to help. That's all they wanted to do. They wanted to find him and to take him into custody. And we, as the agency taking over and ultimately being responsible for prosecution, but also the safety of those officers and the safety of the public, I felt it critical that we take that step at that point and we use one of our SWAT teams that was available to us. At that point, we had a number, but I knew from speaking to Sergeant Roy that our team was not far away, that that's when they should come in and take over that search. Becoming more deliberate now, and we're not responding to an active threat where people are being killed or hurt by him. We are a little more measured in our response to that situation. Any questions over what I've covered so far?
Deborah.
Okay, thank you. So could you, where was the information about Mr. Card's weaponry, that sort of thing, coming to you from?
It was passed to me in the command post that someone had seen a picture of him in social media holding a rifle with what they believed to be a thermal scoper on it.
Any other information come into you regarding his, firearms from any other sources?
There at that point, there is a flood of information. The police department is, again, we talked to the room we're in now, double the amount of people that are in it. There were numerous calls. I know from talking to our dispatch centers in the 24-hour period from the time of the shooting, or 24 hours after the shooting, our dispatch center in Augusta received 174 calls. The Lewiston Auburn's communication center received over 700 in the first 24 hours. Information is flooding in. From my perspective, we knew he was armed with a rifle and that he potentially had night vision. Any other information we had was certainly going to be collected. But we knew at that point, he'd been involved in a mass shooting. We'd seen the photos of him holding the rifle. We knew that he had a military background. We have a basis now of knowledge to move forward with.
Just one other quick question, and this may be covered by somebody else at some point, but once the car is located at the boat dock and boat launch in Lisbon, how quickly then did sort of the calculation start about Maine recycling, given its proximity, sort of, how quickly did that shake out?
That did come out fairly quickly in the investigation, but that was one of a dozen locations we were given. And we were also told prior to finding the vehicle that he had access to a boat, that he had access to a motorcycle. There were, at that point, we've entered into the realm of speculation, and it's a bit of a game. And we are fielding these calls in the command post, and they're being relayed to us. And we are now trying to prioritize them. And I think Sergeant Roy will certainly touch on Maine recycling and what he did initially and be able to explain a lot of that. But from the command post, yes, it was made apparent to us. Again, with a number of other places.
Just a second.
So, and I apologize, I mean, not to skip out order on some of this stuff, I'm just writing questions down.
Sure.
So when you, the command post, how did you handle, what process you're trying to manage the radio traffic? Because I can imagine everyone's radio is going off, all the stuff's going on.
So it has to be the implementation of ICS, and the control of that situation has to be done in a very measured manner. Because with the additional reports of an active shooter, what I don't want at that point is first responders to feel that they can't or shouldn't respond to a threat. The worst, or one of the worst case scenarios is at that point taking too much control, because if I have a first responder that is half a mile from what could potentially be an active shooter, I want them to respond as quickly as possible. And that is really where that form of decentralized command comes into play. They know the task, they know what needs to be done, and they've shown that over and over in the short amount of time after the shootings. And my job is to help guide that, get the information, and make sure that we're doing it as coordinated and tracked manner as we can.
And that includes EMS, so therefore they would have heard anything that you had to put out, correct? You guys on the same frequencies?
No, we are not. But the same dispatch centers dispatch for both groups.
Okay.
So any of that information should be going out to everyone that's going over through the radios.
And then the other question is, because you had two sites that you knew of, just in time range, were there concerns that you worried about multiple shooters? And at what point did you clearly say, I think we got one here?
It took quite some time in the investigation for us to feel comfortable that there was only one.
Okay.
And you're going to hear some reasons why when they cover the criminal investigation coming up.
Okay.
But very early on, we looked at those photos and as much of the video as we could to try to see, was there anybody else in that vehicle? You can see the one photo that the driver's door is left open. Can you see, and I certainly was not comfortable enough to say at that point that there is absolute certainty that there was no one else in that car.
And last question is, you saw from the picture that Mr. Carr was having a long, heard he was a long gun in the call. How did you identify whether the people responding had enough protection to deal with whatever? Because obviously, like we learned later, that was much more high powered than AR-15, but how did you kind of, you're thinking at the moment, so.
My way of making sure was actually beginning to use the SWAT teams.
No, there's some protection. The officers who are responding, I mean, they have some decent chance. I mean, again, everyone has vests and stuff, but may not have worked with the kind of weapon he had, so. So was that?
Yes, and that is when you see, especially at the boat launch, to make sure, because I don't know what every police department has for protection or weapons. That is why you see, having worked in this area, knowing at that point that we had Portland Police were there with their SWAT team, Cumberland County SWAT team. You start to see these other SWAT teams to help mitigate. Again, we're never going to eliminate the rest of those first responders, but to mitigate that, that's when we start implementing the use of SWAT teams, because I know they have the appropriate equipment in most circumstances.
Thank you.
So sort of a follow-up on that. At some point, you did learn that the murder weapon was a .308 caliber, which is a much more powerful weapon than a standard AR-15.
Correct.
When did you find that out?
There were some initial reports from the scene from first responders that were identifying the casings there. And then after the search of the suspect's vehicle from the boat launch, the initial search of it.
And some law enforcement body armor can resist that high power cartridge, but others can't.
Correct.
Was that initial information put out to all law enforcement to be particularly cautious because of the power of the weapon?
That was initially reported to me by radio and by phone. So did I specifically ask for that to be rebroadcast? I did not.
Thank you.
In political, yeah.
Could you further clarify what you meant by, there was confusion as to who was law enforcement or not at the Walmart distribution center
Yes.
scene?
The way it was relayed to me is you had groups of officers implementing a specific tactic, as they should, for responding to an active shooter. And these two groups had gone into or entered a building from different entrance points and then converged upon each other. And the way it was described to me is there was a brief challenge back and forth before there was a confirmed understanding that both groups were in fact law enforcement.
And did that result because they weren't in uniform, or how did that confusion occur?
I think you have groups of people that are not accustomed to working together. You have groups coming from every area in the state. State police had people from as far away as Aroostook and York County responding. And you again had police officers from every town, I think, that was working, responded. And I think it also speaks to I mentioned it earlier, the heightened emotions, the intensity of the situation.
Is that something that can be avoided?
Can it be with communication? Yes. However, and I believe these two groups did, they used tactics to ensure that there was no friendly fire. But it's an issue that we have to be aware of, and that really brought it to my attention in the command post. So yes, there are things that they will do to communicate and identify themselves as police officers to each other. And that was done relatively quickly, but moving forward, again, that raises that issue or that challenge to me of that is now something I'm aware of, and I need to make sure I'm mitigating that.
In somewhere in the materials that have been sent to us, was an indication that the Maine Intelligence Analysis Center had created a law enforcement sensitive bulletin that ended up being leaked online.
Yes,
Has the source of that leak been identified?
it is not.
And what challenges did that present?
Well, and I think you're going to hear more about information, law enforcement sensitive information that was leaked. The initial challenge that represents is Robert Card looking at the media and looking at social media? And is there information that he could obtain from that and see in the news or on social media that people are posting that could give him an indication of where we are and what we're doing and what tactics we're using.
Did it also present challenges in terms of others making calls to the MIAC or otherwise interacting in a way that they wouldn't have if the bulletin hadn't been leaked, such as the press?
I would have to defer to the lieutenant and anyone that was in the MIAC that night. I know that they had a group working and I know that there were calls, but I don't know the extent of what happened there.
Did you go to the boat launch that night?
I did not.
So you have no information, personal information about the condition of the scene at the boat launch when the TAC teams arrived?
I don't, but you'll hear from Sergeant Roy, who was one of the first responders there. I think he'll be able to answer any questions you have about that night. It was relayed to me in the command post that the area, much like what I'd seen at the police department when I got there, was very congested. In fact, some people had to walk to get to the suspect's vehicle because there were so many cruisers and police cars lining the roads around it. And then at one point it was relayed to me that there were people in the woods to the north of the vehicle.
And in terms of the review that has been conducted so far, have you identified, as we've just talked about some of them, the challenges that you faced that night?
Yes,
Those have been identified?
we very early on identified some of the challenges.
Could you share what those are, what you've identified as challenge?
Yes, you have an estimates of 400 law enforcement officers. All of them want to help. All of them are responding, not all of them, but we identified very early on that we will refer to it as self-dispatching. We've seen it in other major scenes where people will hear of something on the radio and they rush to help. And you end up with hundreds of law enforcement officers at that scene. There are times where that's what we want, but there's also times where that makes the command and control and the decision-making process and searching very difficult.
Is that the only challenge that you've identified?
No.
What are the rest of them?
If we could, I think Sergeant Roy, again, will talk about some of those. And as the investigation team presents, I think you'll see some of them. Some I've already mentioned, for instance, the sheer number of calls coming into the dispatch center and the volume of information coming to us. It took time to implement a way to catalog all that, track it, and make sure that we're appropriately following up on it. Also making sure and being able to accurately tell where law enforcement is and where they're not. One thing we did not want to do is go into an area searching for the suspect and then encounter other law enforcement officers unexpectedly.
And having identified these challenges, what response has been taken or is in the process of being taken?
We have some suggestions. I think maybe if we could touch on those at the end, but some thoughts that we have about how to implement processes and to explain the reasoning that we have for doing things a certain way, the ICS model. But we do have some suggestions or of training and maybe some exercises that we could do that would allow us all to work better together.
And those will be addressed further on today.
I can address a few of them now if you'd like, but that's completely up to the commission.
If that doesn't break the flow of your presentation or disrupt how you want to see, that would be helpful.
Excuse me, sorry. So I think that you've already heard from some of those involved, but I think that a critical portion of this is having those relationships within those police departments at the command level. It eases communication. So for instance, that night, something that I think made the initial command post go well is Lieutenant Thies. I think he's been here. He and I were detective sergeants together. Sergeant Joey Brown, who was one of the sergeants for the patrol that night, he and I were detectives together. I've worked alongside of many of those people Though they may not all know my name and I may not know theirs, we can look at each other and there is that recognition and that history of working together. I think that streamlines all of this. I'm not an unknown to them when I walk in. And it's also one of the things that allows us to implement ICS relatively quickly because we know each other. I know when Chief St. Pierre walks in the room, I know who the decision makers are and the people that I can go to within that police department to work with. I think that looking at and reviewing critical incidents that have happened in Maine and other states, whether it's nationally or within New England, is critical. It has been, we can learn lessons from them and not repeat those mistakes. We should implement regional training. We are good at training within our groups. Instances like this, we had law enforcement from as far away as, our federal partners from as far away as California. So working amongst our regions within Maine, I think doing some exercises would help to streamline a lot of this process. I think you brought it up, Doctor, equipment, technology. Making sure that those first responders and those with responsibilities in these investigations or these crimes have the equipment they need. And then the final part to that, I think something that has been done well, but we can always continue to improve, is the response to our victims, to their wellness, but also to that of the first responders.
So early in your remarks, you talked about, and I sort of wrote it down, you said at this point, all the efforts were pretty collaborative. You recall saying that?
Yes.
Was there a point at which that became less so?
They only become less collaborative because at that point, specifically when we find the car, we change our tactics a little bit. We become more deliberate. So you're now not seeing the first responders dispatching and going, or us asking them to go search areas, because now we have, for instance, when the vehicle was found, you heard us talk about NESPAC earlier, New Hampshire was there with their helicopter, and that gave us the ability to fly over these scenes using their technology to be able to search them. And again, I think Sergeant Roy will touch on a lot of that. But then we started implementing, for some of the reasons I think that the committee has already looked at, we started using the SWAT teams that were available to us. Our first responders did a fantastic job at making sure the killing stopped by going to all these other scenes. But now that we're in a much more deliberate search and we have those people with a higher level of training and equipment available to us, that was the way to move forward. That was the tool to use in that particular situation.
So when you talk about things becoming less collaborative, I'm taking from your response that simply means, there was a streamlining of who would respond to what, where, and when.
Yes.
Okay. So as opposed to sort of more contentious interactions.
Yes, I know that my decision and my request to have those officers not approach that car was not a popular one. Knowing what I know today, I would make that same decision.
And just really quickly, when did the FBI arrive? When did they enter the mix?
Very early on, we have our local agents that were there, because we began working with them relatively quickly to set up some victim services. They have a very robust program. I think you'll hear Lieutenant Crane and Sergeant Mitchell speak about that later, but that was very early on offered to us, and we asked for that immediately.
And when you talk about regional training as one of the potential recommendations coming out of this, would that include federal law enforcement?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
When you talked about, concern about self-dispatching officers showing up from all over the place, in the past or in this situation, was there ever a concern about what actual law enforcement authority they have if they're a municipal officer in Cumberland County or in Knox County to actually do something as a police officer in Androscoggin County?
I think the lieutenant colonel would be the one to touch on that later. But in this instance, if you have a Cumberland County deputy who's just over the line,
Yeah, I said municipal officer.
we'll use Portland PD. And they can be one of the first ones there. We absolutely want that. If that is going to save lives. And we have some agreements, much like with NESPAC, we refer to NESPAC as the biggest, mutual aid compact in the nation, because we have a statute, Title 25, that allows us to use that and implement that. So I think, again, the Lieutenant Colonel could touch on that later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned, and I think other reports have mentioned that during that initial period, you folks have multiple contacts with the Card family to get information and all kinds of. How did you and also, to ensure they weren't targeted, because I think there was a concern that they could come back and get them.
Yes.
How did you try to coordinate the law enforcement response? Because it sounds like there may have been multiple agencies trying to get information from the family, and how to collate that and also ensure that there's no confusion between who's actually in charge asking those questions.
Well, initially, with that family, it became controlled because we needed to provide them security, and that was assigned to them.
By state police?
I'm sorry?
By state police?
We helped make the assignment, but we were not on, and again, Sergeant Roy will touch on some of that when he covers the tactics of this incident, but we started to help coordinate that through our MCUs. So we had Lieutenant Keaton, who is the supervisor for the Southern Criminal Division, that investigative division, and Sergeant Farley were both there.
I just have a couple of questions. That's always dangerous when you say that. And if you're not the right person to respond, just pass me off and we'll hear from somebody else.
Yes.
My first question was, when you talked about self-dispatching, the thought that came to mind with the 3 Lisbon officers who we heard from a week ago, who were looking through Maine recycling in the trailers. Were you aware of the fact that they were doing that, or is that an example of self-dispatch, whether it's?
I was not aware until after. But again, as part of that deliberate approach, especially as we implement ICS, a number of those places and others were searched multiple times. So the difference I see there is in the initial phases of this, we need people out looking. We need that saturation of those areas to hopefully, if we can't find the suspect, we can at least contain them. And at that point, they're searching an area that's known to them. A big part of this, and you had mentioned collaboration earlier, a part of this is we needed our local and county law enforcement in their communities, because the calls that were coming in, they know them the best. We also provide rural patrol, but no one is going to know the town better than those police officers. And you mentioned them searching that trailer. And there's a later incident where they see a truck and they say, hey, the seat of that truck has never left like that. I work this area. I'm a midnight shift police officer and I see that truck all the time. That kind of information is critical. So there were other instances of self-dispatching where, for instance, we'd assigned a SWAT team to search a residence, and that SWAT team showed up and there were officers already there, and in some cases already searching. And that can create some potentially tragic circumstances.
So self-dispatching is desirable at the beginning, and as you try to move into a more controlled, directed effort, it is something that you try to discourage. And my memory is that those officers took appropriate measures not to expose themselves beyond their capacity. They didn't open doors and that sort of thing.
The first responders that night searching the trailers, yes.
This question may not be one for you to respond to, but at some point, just sort of an obvious question. Once the car was located, why wasn't a tracking dog used?
There's a number of reasons. I think Sergeant Roy is going to discuss that.
That's you want him to.
But initially, we knew New Hampshire was flying over that area with a thermal camera from their helicopter, and that can eliminate huge sections of land that needs to be searched. And then combined with, and again, Sergeant Roy will add to this, that initial containment ring being set up around the vehicle. And I'm not faulting the officers for that ring, that is appropriate at that point. But having the combination of pavement, those vehicles continuing to run, the fact that a helicopter is now overhead. If any of you have ever stood under a helicopter, you feel that rotor wash that comes down. That is dispersing any scent that may have been left, even essentially eliminating it. And I have experience of trying to do with my time on the tactical team, doing a search with a canine under a helicopter. It's a nighttime wooded search with a canine is probably the most dangerous operation law enforcement will undertake, especially in a circumstance like this.
In understanding that, we'll be hearing more, whose decision was it to call in the helicopters?
That was mine.
It was.
Yes, NESPAC is typically invoked by the colonel or his designee. Situation like this, I know what the colonel would want me to do. I didn't hesitate once that resource was made available. And you'll see that one of the captains that responded from New Hampshire, he and I have known each other for probably 2005. We were both brand new members of our SWAT teams and we trained together actually in their state. So that initial decision was mine.
And was that decision made understanding the impact that it could have on a potential canine search?
Yes, it was. That tool is a force multiplier beyond the canine. It is very effective. Any movement at night, every piece of technology, whether it's a canine or a camera on one of these helicopters, none of them are perfect. But that tool is, in my opinion, much more effective and much safer for law enforcement and the members of the community than having them doing a canine track at that point. Because that initial impression or concern that I had about this being an ambush, having that helicopter there would readily, within reason, is going to be able to tell us if there is someone lying in wait in those woods or if there's someone just observing. You're going to be able to see movement and people much easier.
And again, if this is a question that's more appropriately put to Sergeant Roy, please let me know. But was a decision ultimately made, an affirmative decision made, not to try to use the canines?
At that time, there was, yes.
And who made that?
Ultimately, that's my decision, though that's with consultation with the people at the scene.
And are the reasons you made that decision those that you've just stated?
That is some of it, yes.
And what were the rest?
I think Sergeant Roy would be, as he was the one that was there, one of the people that was there would be best to, he can kind of relay some of those other concerns or issues that we discussed. One other thing that I will add that it was part of is, again, we are receiving now a flood of information. And we're also receiving at about this time, we get the information of the Springworks farm and that there's a possible sighting or that there's a bathroom that's locked. So as we are receiving information, it's a constant evaluation and prioritization of risk to the public. If we're receiving calls that he's in a building or there's been a sighting, that is going to take priority over a canine track that is potentially 3+ hours old. And I think that we have that duty to the public where if he is in a public area and where it's reported that he may be, we have to respond to that first.
Would you use the same resources? Or would the canine resources be separate and distinct from the resources you would use to respond to a sighting?
They would be the same. So if, for instance, this didn't happen, but if, for the sake of discussion, if we asked a patrol officer with their canine to do that search, as you've already mentioned, the patrol officer does not have the appropriate body armor. My understanding, and though this could differ from police department to police department, that patrol officer does not have the same training and tactics that our SWAT teams do. Equipment we mentioned, they also don't have the ability to use night vision. So I guess I would ask you to do this. Some night when you're at home, stand in the dark and have someone walk around with a flashlight. Now imagine you're armed with a rifle. how easy it would be to shoot and ambush that person. So we would essentially be asking a patrol officer with their canine to go into the woods without the ability to see at night, using a white flashlight, shining it around as they walk through the woods against a person who has military training. And at that time, we believed a thermal scope. So no, I would say that from my position as a leader, I would be negligent to ask someone to do that. And we, again, the Lieutenant Colonel is going to touch on it. We have policies and procedures in place that would actually tell our people to not do that.
And sending in a canine officer with a TAC team officer who did have the appropriate,
It wouldn't be just one. If you were going to send a canine, I think Sergeant Roy, he's the most current on tactics, would be the one, but it would be a fairly large contingent of people.
Nothing further?
Just one quick question. Again, I understand that that's always relative. At what point did you receive tips that, concrete tips that he may be at Maine Restoration? And again, if this is more appropriate for somebody else.
I think that can certainly come in through the investigation. And you're going to hear about a number of other believed to be at the time concrete tips. So this is a very steady flood of information. And I understand that having the vehicle in that proximity, it does tend to lead people to focus on that tip, but let's not forget, we also had tips that in Rumford, and people showed us photos of what they believe to be him. So you're gonna see or hear more about that from our investigation.
I'll wait then. Thank you very much.
Here, thank you very much. I think it might be appropriate to take a 10-minute break at this point, and then we'll resume. So it will be 10 minutes besides my technical line.
Thank you.
The only way I'm ever gonna get oriented to the Lord is to go there.
Yeah.
And look around. Because I'm listening to these maps again. Confused all over.
Okay. Our executive director is out on the phone, but she's fine with us proceeding. I believe that we completed with you, and the next would be Major Lucas Hare.
This may.
I'm Major Gosselin, I think would be next.
Oh, excuse me, I jumped down one to the, Major Gosselin.
Thank you.
Okay, excuse me.
Morning. So I think it's probably going to be. It's probably gonna be easier for me to just direct you to the lime green tab in the handouts that we provided. That's where I'm gonna kick it off. So my name is Scott Gosselin. I'm a major with the Maine State Police. Started my career back in 2000, working patrol around the Lewiston, Auburn area. I patrolled the towns around Minot, Livermore, Turner, Green, Leeds, Durham, and Wales. From there, I became a detective, worked in the major crimes unit for several years, was an evidence response technician for many years during that time, became a bloodstain pattern analyst, and then transitioned over to the crime lab, where I managed evidence coming in at the crime lab, all related to homicide cases that were happening across the state. And then became the crime lab director, and then went back to the major crimes unit to help run Major Crimes South. And then from there, I transitioned over here to major at headquarters. The last 10 years or so of my career, before I was a major, I was part of the incident management team that we have. It's called our IMAT, Incident Management Assistance Team. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about ICS and the structure we were running in Lewiston when this tragedy happened. So what is Incident Command System? It's really developed in the 1970s. It was really came out of fighting forest fires as a way for firefighters to help manage the incident and critical incidents. And from there, it's become really an all-hazard way to structure command and control in a way that allows command to take place in a very structured way. There is an organizational chart, there are command posts, and there's just, it gives you the overall structure that you need in order to properly make the command that you need to have. It's been used by the Coast Guard to clean up oil spills. It's been used by emergency responders from all over the country. It's very versatile and adaptable, and it might, I can just imagine, it's really been perfected by our friends in firefighting. And they've done a really good job as far as kind of showing us and law enforcement really how to use this in terms of the incidents that we have. And I imagine that people looking at incident command would say, how would you structure it for a homicide case? How would you use it for a homicide case? We use it for oil spills. We use it to fight forest fires, but how would you use it in a homicide case? But I can tell you, going back to now, I think Camden Hughes, the Camden Hughes case was one of the very first cases that we had where we used incident command. And Camden Hughes was a little boy that was found in North Berwick. And we used incident command because at the time, nobody knew who this little boy was, and he had been murdered and left on the side of the road. So some of you may remember this case, but that there was a great need for incident command because there was such a huge national response to that incident. But it is highly versatile and adaptable, so we do use it for homicide cases. We use it for missing people. We use it for manhunts. And we've become pretty good about getting it done. I think that the most important thing to mention about ICS is that it really brings order out of the chaos. You can see on the handout that I provided that there is a structure. It's really a template and how they would, it's an example of how you would set up a structure. You can see there's blue and orange tabs, if you will, that identify an incident commander. It identifies a public information officer. All of those orange tabs up top there are command. Then you have your ones in dark blue, and the dark blue ones are your section chiefs. There are 4 section chiefs: operations, planning, logistics, finance, and administration. And then you have all of your individual leaders under those. So let's just take a quick look at Lewiston. And this is the org chart that we set up to kind of explain how we were running things in Lewiston. I've made sure that we've got command up top in black. And over here, this first tier with green, blue, brown, and red are all your section chiefs. And operations is outlined here in blue. So as you can tell, operations was really the heaviest and most involved at the time. Finance, this poor guy has nobody underneath him. And that's usually because for finance, if you think about it, the first couple of days, we're not looking at, geez, you're on overtime, maybe you shouldn't respond to that. Doesn't matter. Everybody's going. We're going to give it as many resources as it needs to resolve the situation. So finance usually takes a backseat in the very first stages as the incident wanes along. And I can tell you, looking back at the manhunt that we had for Robert Burton back in Parkman, as that one went along for several weeks, finance became an issue because we had to start looking at control of resources and what we were spending at certain times. But that really didn't have that much of a role here. Logistics is, of course, all in support of operations, and planning is usually our planning section chiefs look ahead to the next day. So say on October 26th, one of the things that our planning chiefs were doing is planning for October 27th, presuming and assuming that this was going to need command and control for that next day. On October 27th, they were planning for the 28th. On October 28th, had the incident not been resolved by then, we would have been looking to transition to a new command post. And at that time, by transitioning to a new command post, that's going to be pretty heavy lift on the planning unit to move that whole operation from Lewiston High School, which is behind me. You would have moved it from Lewiston High School over to a different command post. So just, in relation to the slide I have here, and the example that we have, that's how it translated into Lewiston. So just a little bit about our IMAT team. Our IMAT team was formed in 2005. It was not long after 9/11 that this team was formed. And it was really in collaboration with MEMA using Homeland Security funding. We bought a mobile command post. It allows us to go to remote areas and set up that mobile command post, even in areas that we might not normally have communications or power. For example, the Eugene Cole incident in Norwich Walk or the Robert Burton manhunt in Parkman. Those are remote areas. A mobile command post is necessary. It provides bathroom facilities, electronics, a place for people to get out of the elements and help run a scene. So it's just a mobile CP. The early days of IMAT, if you turn to that page, you can see where some of the very early incidents we went to, and I've already mentioned Camden Hughes in 2010. But incident command, especially because law enforcement funerals are so large that we usually roll out incident command to help take control of who's doing what, when, what's happening, when, and it's a really effective way to use command and control for an event like a funeral, which would be very, very large, involving thousands of visitors from out of state. The Ayla Reynolds case had incident command and involved incident command. So you can see a bunch of them there. But those very early days of IMAT really involved mapping and organization. The very first 10 years of IMAT, it was all about, hey, we're in Norridgewock. Let's map what the canines are doing. Let's map what areas have been searched. Let's do the mapping, and make sure that our folks on the ground, the boots on the ground, have the resources they need to properly do their job in operations. And also to make sure that, food, logistics, lodging, that all those things are taken care of. So mapping and organization were really the key elements of IMAT in the first 10 years. Well, in recent years, what we've recognized in the first 10 years was that communication was a challenge. Communication between us and our partners who are working the event. So for example, communication between command and the section chiefs and everybody underneath it. One of the things that we've learned to do and adapt to is to create a website that would allow us to communicate with our partners. So for example, if you came to the command post for an 8 o'clock briefing, you would come in, you would scan a 2D barcode. It would take you to a website where you would see this org chart. You would see the phone numbers of the people associated with it. So if you had questions, issues, concerns, you could do that. You could voice those concerns and make those comments by using that website. Unfortunately, as great as websites are, and again, in some of the cases where we recently used websites, the Eugene Cole Manhunt, COVID Command Post, the National Governors Conference, and the death of Ben Campbell and his funeral in 2019. Using those websites is such a great thing, but it's very difficult to do when you have a dynamic event. Most of these events, unlike, homicides, when you have a planned event and we're planning for some kind of, let's see, like the governor's conference, or if you're planning for the governor's inauguration and we're running incident command, we can create a command post. We can attach the incident action plans. We can have the whole organizational structure that we can give to people. We'll have packets already made. There's a big difference between planned events and dynamic events. I provided 2 organizational charts, 2 screenshots of organizational charts that you're going to see here. One from the governor's inauguration, the other from Detective Ben Campbell's funeral services. Both of those were planned events where we could sit down for 3 or 4 days and plan this event. In some cases, it might take a week or even 2 weeks to plan an event. And what we would do is we would sit down with the stakeholders, the people that we had put in unified command. They would make decisions as related to what are our objectives in this case. Okay, now that we have our objectives, what are our strategies and tactics to help us achieve those objectives? That can all be done in a controlled environment in a planned event. When you have a dynamic event, it all has to be done on the fly. So let's look at the planned versus dynamic events for Lewiston. Planned events, again, their inaugurations, funerals, large protests or assemblies, regular meetings with key stakeholders need to take place. We can plan those objectives and strategies. Resources are coordinated ahead of time. Website and communication platforms are built. This is great. All these events usually go off without a hitch, and communication is really done in a way that allows folks to voice their concerns. Hey, where am I supposed to stand for this event? Oh, by the way, could I get a sandwich? Or when is lunch coming? When are you guys providing lunch for us? That kind of thing. But with dynamic events, it's very different, right? People are coming and they're planning on the fly, and it is very difficult. It's very difficult to get those elements into place. And I will tell you that typically from my experience, most of the time that work happens during the overnight hours. And that's because you're dealing with the fewest amount of people in any given event are going to be there during the hours from, usually midnight to 4 a.m. That's where the IMAT structure gets into place. Here's an example of that. In the Eugene Cole manhunt that we had, I remembered I arrived at the scene in Norridgewock maybe around 10 o'clock in the morning. I approached the incident commanders and said, we need to sit down, start talking about objectives, strategies, tactics. And you can imagine at that point, they're looking for our individual, our suspect. They looked at me like I had three heads. So Gosselin, step back. We're right behind this guy. We'll get him as he's right around the corner. We're right on his tail. Well, by 6 o'clock that night, still no suspect in custody. I approached, I did the same thing. We need to sit down. We need to start putting this thing together. Nope, well, we're almost there. Whatever we have is telling us that he's moving in this direction and we're following and we've got air assets moving this way. Just give us a little bit more time. Well, by midnight that night, as we all know, that didn't happen. And that's where incident command got set up, is usually in the overnight. So by 8 o'clock in the morning, our beginning of our first operational cycle, everything had been set up. And part of that, especially in the Eugene Cole case, was that we were operating out of a room about this size, again, with about double the amount of people in it. And when you have that and your commanders in black up top there are getting inundated with officers coming in, everybody has questions, people looking for answers, people have information, people have intelligence. It's a very chaotic scene to have all of that in one place. The best thing we can do, and I think it was brilliant, somebody from Lewiston Police Department made the suggestion to go to Lewiston High School. It was, that was probably the best place for a command post that I've ever been to. And the setup for it, I thought was done very, very well. So dynamic events and planning on the fly can be a little bit difficult. And I've already touched on the next slide that I have here. Some of the law enforcement barriers to setting up incident command is our own denial that we need to set it up because this incident is going to end at any given moment. The other problem that we often have is our folks often feel like they've been a part of this thing from the very beginning. They don't want to go home. They want to stay there and they want to see this thing through to the end and resolve and watch this thing resolve and be a part of that resolution because they're emotionally invested, just like our first responders were when they responded. The problem with that, of course, as you know, is when people start working beyond 18 hours, and they're there for 24 or they're there for 30, it becomes a problem because then you've got sleep and fatigue and it's time to send people home. And that's why we have set operational cycles so that we can replace people on a cycle. And you can have, say, for example, 2 people working your investigation tier during the first operational cycle and another 2 coming in with that same experience from a different part of the state to work the next operational cycle. And that's a struggle that we often have with these incidents. So looking at Lewiston and what happened to Lewiston on October 25th, I've already talked about the decision for a command post that was made in mid-evening, I think, on the night of the 25th. We decided to really have 3 real branches of operations. There was really 4 branches of operations, but for simplicity's sake, I only put 3 up here on the board. And you'll see under operations, you'll see manhunt, which was probably the most robust, and that's everything to the left here in blue. That was probably the most robust part of incident command that we had was the manhunt and all the assets needed for the manhunt. The other side of this was investigation. That's the second branch, and the third branch we had was crime scenes. I would probably argue there was a 4th branch as well that was scene security, that we had MDEA doing a lot of the scene security for us and did an incredible job. They also belonged under operations, but for the sake of simplicity, we broke it down into 3 main categories here: investigations, crime scenes, and manhunts. And again, there are tiers underneath investigations. So for investigations, we had Lieutenant Tremblay that was running the operation, Lieutenant Keaton, Lieutenant Darrin Crane at any given moment during a given operational cycle. And we also broke it down from there. I should also mention that even when you break it down into these boxes, like an intelligence unit, a criminal investigation, legal and affidavits, leads and historical, witnesses, and victim notifications, even when you've got all of these broken down, they even break down even further. And as a matter of fact, you'll see in the Major Crimes South presentation that they've actually broken theirs down, investigation down into the distinct separate parts of that. So this is even broken down further for you that you'll see a little bit later. Excuse me. In this particular case, logistics was really more robust than I've ever seen it. We had the need for a tip line. I think the only other case that I can remember using a tip line was for the Camden Hughes case. That was back in 2010. We also involved advocates and family services. And just think to yourself, if you have 600, 500 police officers arriving unannounced tomorrow, how are you going to feed them? Not only how are you going to feed them, but how are you going to feed them when the whole city is shut down? So not only feeding them, but lodging, and at least providing for lodging for those that asked. All of those things fall under a logistical responsibility, and those are things that we tried to help set up. Some of the lessons we learned from Boston Marathon through the years has been ICS helps with self-deployment, and when people do self-deploy, where can we plug them in? Helps with self-dispatching, because you are allowed to control the information, so that information isn't spread willy-nilly through the command post. And then leaks and misinformation, again, you can help control information. The objectives in this particular case were to locate card and ensure that criminal investigation could be done safely. You see my next page there where I just have a picture of the organizational chart, but I have it up here on the board that I've been referring to. Then there's the Lewiston High School command post. Probably I should take a minute just to talk a little bit about that. The command post, again, I really think this was a great idea. When we were at Lewiston Police Department that first night around 10 or 11 o'clock, I think we made the suggestion to go to Lewiston High School. And what it allowed us to do was control access, right? So you have check-in at one point. You put somebody there, everybody coming through those doors has to check in. And we were allowing anybody who had a role in the investigation. That's not just sworn individuals. We're also talking about civilian counselors and chaplains and other folks like that who had a role in the event to come into the command post, but you did have to check in. First responder rest area, we used the gym. We set up cots in the gym so that if first responders, not just first responders, but investigators as well, didn't want to go home, or they lived in Ellsworth, or they lived in Fort Kent, they could actually grab a sleeping bag and have a nap on a cot. Staging area, that was in the cafeteria. So there was an indoor and an outdoor staging area. Obviously, the outdoor staging area was the parking lot. You have to, even if you have half of these teams that are at the Lisbon High School at the staging point over at Lisbon High School, or if you're at the staging point at Lewiston High School, you're still talking about a lot of assets here. There were, I believe, 350 people involved in all of the SWAT team assets that we had. That's a lot of people. And even if you had only half of them, their staging area needs to be large enough to contain not only them, but all of their gear and their assets, with their tactical assets that they bring. Then the command post room, that's where we were doing the briefings. And off behind the command post room, and what we can talk about the things that we would do differently, because I've got a bunch of ideas for improvement on this, but I think we would have controlled access to this back hallway a little bit more. We allowed people to go in between so that people felt like they could, if they had something for investigators, they could give it to them. If they had something for the counselors, they could give it to them. But I think looking back on it, we probably would have controlled that just a little bit more, because not that it was overrun, but there was a lot of people going back and forth. And I think, again, all about incident command is about controlling the information and making sure that our partners know how to get the information to who needs to have it. We had a room for the FBI. Actually, they had several breakout rooms up in this area. Unified Command had a room over here if they needed to break away, if the colonel and the chief needed to break away and have a discussion, they could do that here. We did have a tip line that we broke out as well. You can see there's a few other rooms that we had there for meeting space and for other various purposes. really was the best command post, at least that I had seen, set up. I had a few pictures in there that you can see of, folks at the command post. On that very first page of photos, you're seeing pictures from the command post room. And that was really from the middle of the high school. If you look towards the center, you'll see that command post room. And that's where the briefings were done. And that's where the announcement had been made where, he had been located. Then we had a room for intelligence that came under investigations. That room for intelligence, you can see it there. We had analysts from the MIAC and from New Hampshire's Information and Analysis Center. We also had federal agents there as well, helping us with intel. The next one just shows a couple of these are school rooms that we just converted over into meeting rooms for chaplains, for our victim advocates so that they could coordinate meetings, coordinate resources to the Family Assistance Center that I know Sergeant Mitchell and Lieutenant Crane are going to talk about. And so these rooms are really important to at least break out and be able to talk amongst themselves. Next photo we have is of the chaplain's room there, and there's a photo of our new recruits that were working the call center tip line that we had set up. And what they were doing is you can see them with their laptops, they're plugging in the tips they were getting on that tip line. They were plugging in that information and plugging it into a Google spreadsheet that we were using. Victim notification, same thing there. It's, making sure that the notifications were made under that subset. And then you see in the next slide has some newsprint up. This was just newsprint that we had on the wall identifying, okay, who was involved at each location. Because of course, when you get there, communication is key. And knowing who was involved and what time was notification made, when were they identified, all that. You have to track all of that because otherwise you don't want to make notification to somebody before the identification's been made. You don't want to make notification to somebody who maybe has a next of kin that should have been notified instead of that person. It's knowing the right persons to notify. It's not always an easy process of knowing who to notify and when. And a lot of that relies on a lot of coordination and collaboration between the Major Crimes Unit, our medical examiner's office, trying to think, and the Attorney General's office as to when those notifications can be made. The next slide, you see just a small list of the folks that did check in with us, that checked in at that front table. These were all the different agencies that showed up and checked in at that front table. And then finally, the very last piece of information I have for you is the in-process action reviews. I can tell you, and I'm going to just jump right to the right-hand side, right-hand column, the items in blue. Because on Friday afternoon, we had recognized that there were some deficiencies in the command structure that we really wanted to change and double down on. First on that list, communicating the command structure to our partners with visible leadership indicators. It's probably going to sound silly, but I feel like had we had vests or lanyards that identified who was in each of these roles, I think communication would have gone quite a bit smoother. We've identified that, and if you go to any of these major incidents across the country, they have, and they manufacture these incident command vests that you wear that are different colors that you put on, and people can readily identify who's in charge of what and go to that person fairly quickly and fairly easily. And that was certainly, I think, an issue. And it was not an issue that we had really seen before, because if you look at most of our past incidents, a lot of these incidents are amongst ourselves or a partner, whether it's a state, county, or municipal partner that we all know. So if this incident would have taken place and it was just the Lewiston Police Department and the Maine State Police, there may not have been a need to have those vests or lanyards to identify, because we all know each other and we all know the roles that we play in our agencies. However, in this particular case, when our federal partners came in and didn't know who we were, that's where I think that some of the communication fell off, and certainly it was a point for improvement there. I think briefing at the branch level, and that's briefing across the branches. So when I talk about the manhunt, that's Lieutenant Stevenson, Lieutenant Pickering, and Sergeant Roy that were in charge of that manhunt, and all of those assets fell under them. Investigation, I talked before, it was Lieutenant Keaton, Lieutenant Tremblay, and Lieutenant Crane. All of those assets fell under them. And crime scenes, you had Sergeant Bryant and Sergeant Rose that were in charge of those. And I think had we been briefing across this level up top here, then they briefed their section managers up top, which was happening, but they weren't briefing across the lines. And that would have been something, looking back on it, we really should have forced that hand of, let's get these guys together to make sure that nothing is slipping through the cracks. There should have been regular briefings across those branches. So we've identified that as a deficiency. We've never, I don't know that we've ever really had that many branches set up that they needed to coordinate and communicate and brief across those lines. But it's certainly a piece for improvement there. Having a regular briefing schedule, which I think we did, but there are some times that will, the briefing schedule will need to be adjusted based on things and incidents that are happening. For example, if we're searching a building, we really think that the individual is in this building. Well, let's wait until they're done searching the building before we have the briefing, because we may be able to talk about good news versus bad news about finding him or not in that building. So I think regular briefing times would have been good. And self-dispatching, I think, inhibited some operational deconfliction and other agency familiarity with ICS. Every police officer in Maine is trained in ICS. We all have 100 and 700 at the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. Our troopers through the years, up until about a year ago, they were all getting at least ICS 200 as well as 100 and 700. And most of our lieutenants are asked to go to TEACS, which is in Texas. It's like a fully immersive training where you involve yourself in an incident like we just had. And they create this incident for you, and you play a role in it as one of these branch managers or section chief or in command or the PIO, and you've got to go out there and make those statements. It's excellent training. Highly recommend it. We ask all of our lieutenants and our leadership to do that. Some of the things that I think we did well, definitely the emergency life-saving efforts by first responders. All of those first responders saved lives, no doubt. The suspect was found in about 48 hours, a little over 48 hours, without any further harm or injury. I think the command post setup, like I talked about, was done really well. That upper level briefing structure and having those upper level briefings regularly at 08 and at 2000 was good. The general structure was good. The QRF staging areas were done really well. The victim services was amazing. It's something that I'd never seen before in my career. And like I said, my first homicide was back in 2002, and the Brandon Thongsavon case in Lewiston. And I had never seen victim services set up like I saw here, and it was just amazing. And certainly something we'd like to learn, and a good takeaway for us from the FBI. Wellness and counseling. We had wellness, our wellness folks and counselors right in the command post for law enforcement officers, as well as at the Family Assistance Center. But having them in the command post and having their own room and having an area where they could debrief officers was great, was really a success. And having the rest area where people could lay down and get some sleep was excellent, as well as logistics. A lot of the food that we had for the command post was actually donated to us, and that's not uncommon. We saw the same thing during the manhunt, the Eugene Cole manhunt for John Williams was all of these donations came in, and it's just amazing the kindness that people that come out of these situations. But that's all I have. I'm available for questions.
Any questions? Yeah.
And I understand that you made some of the victim notifications yourself,
Yes.
which I'm sure is extraordinarily difficult all the time, but you probably know that some of the victims' families complained about the delay in making notifications. Can you comment on that and the reasons for the delay?
Sure, I think our crime scene guys will be able to talk a little bit about that, but understanding that, there's a process that needs to take place and that the scene needs to be scanned. A typical scene, if you're inside a residential house, and, I'll have them talk more about this because they do it now. We really weren't doing scanning when I was processing scenes, but the scanning that they do now is basically having a total station in the house that digitally scans the whole house. And you need to move it from place to place to place to have that digital scan done. Those scans need to be properly stitched together, or at least checked, to make sure that there are no mistakes, so that when you scan and you stitch those together, you have almost the ability to do a virtual walkthrough electronically on your laptop. And obviously, that's what we had here. So those needed to be scanned before bodies could be moved. Once we were able to move the bodies, then we had to involve the medical examiner's office to help us move the bodies. Do they get transported with the medical examiner's office? Do we call funeral home? But there is a little bit of really a painstaking, timely process that needs to take place. And a lot of that has to be very deliberate and purposeful when you're processing a crime scene. I know that most of, if not all of the victims had been identified by 8 o'clock the next morning, and I believe notifications started at 10. So the identity of the person is one thing. Then the next question is, who do we notify and where are they? And making contact. Some of them had called, some of them gave us their information, but not all of them. So certainly that process was a little bit delayed by figuring out who do we notify and what's the best process to do that, and where are they? But I know there are other folks coming behind me that may be able to answer that a little bit further.
All right.
Thank you.
Everett?
Just I have a couple of areas of inquiry here. So I don't know if you were able to take note of the victim's testimony to us a couple weeks ago. And that the fact that the deaf community was disproportionately affected, and some of the concerns that they had about the ability to have in-person ASL folks as opposed to tablet-based, communication, given the connectivity and the sort of the overload on internet services at that time. Is that something that you're considering tweaking? Should that a particular community be disproportionately affected in the future?
Yes, absolutely. And I think our victim services, Sergeant Greg Mitchell is going to come up and talk a little bit about those services provided at the Family Assistance Center, but also when we're interviewing people that are not necessarily at the Victim Service Center. We do have an ability to call dispatch and find a person who can help us with ASL. And I know that we had a law enforcement officer on scene who was also capable as well. But absolutely,
And some people were turned away. Some
that's what I
ASL
heard.
folks were turned away.
Yes, I had not heard that before just recently. But it's absolutely something that it's been one of the biggest learning experience of this whole event, is that we have not had to deal with that
Sure.
at this level in the past, and it was certainly a learning piece for us.
I have a couple more questions when the victims folks come up, but I'm reading communicating the blue
Sure.
for improvement.
Right.
Communicating the command structure to partners with visible leadership indicators.
Yes.
It's a great term, but if you could sort of put that in more layman's language, I interpret that as clearly communicating who gets to make the decisions here.
No, it was more so much that when our federal partners came in, or somebody from Aroostook County or Ellsworth Police Department came in, they would know that the guy wearing the green vest is the planning chief. The guy wearing the blue vest is the operations chief. The guys wearing the black, and I'm not talking about necessarily using vests or lanyards,
Sure.
but some visible marker to indicate that these people are in those particular roles. So if somebody had a question, or maybe they had intelligence to provide, hey, I just got a tip from a confidential informant who told me this. Who do I give that information to? It was difficult for them to communicate and find who that person was because we were not wearing vests. Because in the past, we've never really had to wear vests or any kind of visible leadership indicators because people always knew it's, again, when you're dealing with agencies that you don't work with all the time, they don't know who we are and what our roles are. So it wasn't necessarily about who's making the decision. It was more about who is the person I go to with this particular piece of information or with this question.
And how did that manifest as a problem?
I think, you know, if you look at it, when people come in and they ask, I've got this tip, who do I give it to? And they're asking just anybody. I think that had there been a structure in place, for them to actually see, oh, I've got to go to this particular person because they're wearing the investigation. It's part of the investigation. I'm going to go give that information to them. They might not give it to command because they wouldn't need to give it to command, but they would give it to investigation. Or they wouldn't give it to the person wearing the orange vest because that was logistics.
Just one last quick point, then I know there's a ton of other people want to ask you questions. Were directives ever countermanded in the field by this person told me to do this. No, I don't want you to do this. You have to do this by different law enforcement agencies.
You know, I don't know of specific instances of that I can speak to necessarily. The branch managers are coming up behind me. If that was happening in the field, they would know more about it than I would.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. You.
And you, first you, if you had.
Okay. Major, you mentioned that there's some issues that you identified with respect to law enforcement agencies with whom you weren't familiar, with whom you hadn't worked before, and the challenges that presented for incident command. What determines what law enforcement agencies show up for an incident like that? It's leaving out Maine law enforcement.
I think that's a great question. I think early on, some of our law enforcement partners, whether it's the FBI or the ATF, were calling Lewiston Police Department saying, "We heard about what happened. What resources do you need? And send us what you got. Send us the investigators you have." And so up they came. And even when some of them talked to some of us, we said, "Send us this asset, but we're all set with investigators. We do need your helicopter, but we don't need your investigators, or we need your investigators, but we don't need your TAC team." You know, so some of those decisions are made when those agencies will call us direct or folks in command direct, as I know happened at Lewiston PD and with us when we were at the Lewiston Police Department at those early hours.
But did you have law enforcement or others showing up who didn't make a call before doing so?
I think it's safe to say we had lots of law enforcement partners that showed up without ever being requested or even calling. They just came to provide help. And I think a lot of that was out of, everybody, again, I think somebody here said it best, people were just desperate to help.
And what challenges did that present?
Well, if I've used this scenario a few times, if it takes 3 people, 2 days to build a shed, and suddenly you drop 300 people to build the shed, and everybody brings their own equipment, that can cause some logistical problems.
And how do you manage those?
I think incident command is probably the only way that I know how to manage it in such a way where you can control the assignments. And we had people that showed up that didn't have an assignment, and they very patiently waited in the back of the room. Some of those were patrol officers who wanted to help. They showed up from another department. Some of those were federal agents. They showed up, they waited in the back of the room, they waited for an assignment. And I've got to tell you, many times during this event, I came across something and I reached out, got somebody from the back of the room and said, "I've got an assignment for you." We tried very hard to involve as many agencies as we could who showed up, who wanted to help. We tried to do that, but we just, in some instances, there are only certain things that can be done by certain people with certain training and certain gear.
And did you have people that showed up that didn't go through the incident command system that went off on a lark of their own?
I don't know that they showed up. I think there were people in this incident that may have been out in the field doing their own thing, checking on things on their own, probably, that never came to the command post, but were just operating on their own. I think if people came to the command post, saw the structure, saw, at least what was getting done for assignments on the manhunt level, knew that behind us in the back hallway was investigations, that if they had information or wanted to play a role on any side of any branch, they could go and insert themselves and somebody would put them to work.
So how do you manage those entities that don't show up at the command post but are out doing their own thing?
It's very difficult. I would say that if we find out about it, we deal directly with the chief.
And do you know anything in your list of responding agencies? One of them is the Army CID.
Yes,
Do you know whether they appeared after a preliminary phone call, or did they just show up?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Lieutenant Keaton would be able to answer that question, but I don't know. I'd have to look back at the check-in roster and find out who it was and when they showed up in order to know properly.
Just let me interject that your responding agency list that you've given us shows 51 responding agencies, and then it says this is not an inclusive list, an all-inclusive list. So there's a lot of people showing up.
A lot of people, and a lot of those people, like I know the FBI, I know that they brought well over 100 people. I probably guess it was probably closer to 200 that they brought. So each agency listed here brought multiple groups of people.
So first of all, the spontaneous volunteer thing is not unique to you guys. I mean, in the field of disaster response, that's been always like, a challenge, to say the least. Of course, the difference is your folks are showing with a badge, and that's a deference to people saying, hey, someone has a badge, is going to be in charge, kind of thing like that. So the challenge, of course, is how do you incorporate the spontaneous incident post that's got set up somewhere and bring it into your fold so they get looped in. Because I was thinking of that and looking at the picture of command post briefing, I have absolutely no idea looking at this who belongs to what. And I think, with this picture where you're all different officers, and I think in some places where they basically just said the ID, you have no ID, you don't come in here. I don't care what department you're with. If you don't have the ID, you're not coming in. And I think that's something you need to look at. Now, quick question to ask you. You mentioned in your, you kind of know each other with these exercises and you kind of know. Can you tell me a little bit how you folks trained in the past? Because obviously MEMA has their own incident structure. Everybody has their own incident structure. How do you incorporate let's just use the example of Mac, since that's exactly what we're talking about. How did you plan these exercises? How did you execute them? And I'm sure was there ever consideration that outside agencies may come in anyway for mass shooting if it was at a school, for example?
Yeah, so I can tell you for our IMAT team, our Incident Management Assistance team, and just to say one thing about the team, this is a team that responds and doesn't seize control or take over control from an incident. For example, if the Auburn Police Department were to call us and they had an incident and they wanted our help with it, we would show up, provide the structure for them, and plug their people into the critical leadership roles. So that's the difference between an incident management team and an incident management assistance team. We're an assistance team. So you're right, we should probably have a lot more training with outside agencies because it's more likely that we're not going to seize control and do it all ourselves. We're going to be involved and collaborate with a lot of our partners. I can tell you what we have done over the last 5 to 10 years for training on this incident management assistance team is tabletop exercises. We'll go to Holton and we'll sit down in the room and they'll give us a scenario and we will play out that scenario for the next 6 to 8 hours and they'll interject different spoilers into the scenario. We'll identify unified command sitting around the table. We'll work with them to create their objectives. We'll work with them to, once they establish their objectives, to work on their strategies and tactics. Once they've got all that set up and they've got a nice plan, we throw in a spoiler. That ruins their plan and they have to divert from it. And we have done that with other agencies and other partners. We haven't done a lot of it. And I think that's probably going to be important moving forward is, not so much so that we can get to know our other agency partners because we already have strong relationships with other agency partners. That's why we haven't needed these vests in the past. But we don't often train together at this level. And I think those tabletops will be critical, I think, moving forward. It doesn't necessarily have to be active shooter. It can be, you've got a meltdown at a power plant. That's one that we've done several times. You've got an incident on the high rise and down in Kittery. You've got an incident at a school. How are you going to handle it? Absolutely. I think those are all great suggestions for training moving
And
forward.
I want to echo, what we mentioned here about the process identification. That's a field that's really researched a lot in terms of how to best do it. It's not so simple. I mean, it's certainly, I know there's the legal piece of it, but in terms of the actually doing it and I, people remember that more so than actually anything else. They're gonna remember these people didn't tell me what I'm supposed to hear. And I think that was some of the more important pieces to kind of think about when you create a structural. So.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you.
So as I understand it, there were over 100 FBI agents.
That's my understanding, yes.
So there are more FBI agents than Lewiston police officers or state police.
I don't know about state police. But yeah, actually, now that I think about it, they probably were. They outnumbered us for sure.
And do you know what the federal statute or the federal crime they're investigating?
I don't know the federal crime that they're investigating, no.
So they were just there to assist you?
I believe they were there to assist us and looking to maybe make a determination as to, is this domestic extremism? Is it terrorism? So specifically which statute, I couldn't really point to, but I know that those were really the two things that we were looking at as to whether or not, like the colonel had said before, is this really, is the FBI going to be in charge of unified command, or is it state police working a murder case with a mentally ill individual and trying to figure that out? And I think it's more, as time went along, it became more clear what this was.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe Gosselin. We're planning on this 11:30 plus. We're planning on taking a break about 11:45, is that right? For an hour for lunch. Do you have somebody who can come up and do some useful thing in the next 15 minutes? The next person that I have in my list is Lieutenant Stevenson and Sergeant Roy. Maybe we could just talk about the preliminaries of their who they are, what their training is, that sort of thing. And
I think we could do that, or Sergeant Greg Mitchell could talk about the victim services with Lieutenant Crane. I think either one of certainly the tactical side of it is going to be considerably longer.
okay,
You may be able to get that in.
okay, well, let's go with Sergeant Mitchell then.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
We'll try not to use up his 15 minutes for questions. Okay.
Oh, you're so optimistic.
We'll break for lunch.
I know.
I'm sure.
Nothing coming.
If you both could introduce yourselves, that would be a start.
So I'm Lieutenant Darrin Crane. I've been a member of the state police since 1995. Last 17 years of that, I've been a part of Major Crimes Unit. The vast majority of that is covering Aroostook and Washington County. And as a commander, I cover the northern 5 counties. Our role in this was, we were part of the investigative piece, obviously, to begin with. There was a need that arose. Lieutenant Keaton came to us as going to establish and help set up the Family Assistance Center with the various partners. So Sergeant Mitchell was assigned the point of contact for that. He'll do a lot of the presenting for that piece of it. And my role would have been to be the primary point of contact between the command post and the Family Assistance Center for any needs that arose on that side.
Hi, good morning. My name is Greg Mitchell. I'm a detective sergeant for the Maine State Police. I joined the Maine State Police in 2001. having served a couple years with the Aroostook County Sheriff's Department prior to that. In 2012, I was promoted to detective and joined the Major Crimes Unit North. And 2020, I was promoted to sergeant, which means I lead a team of 6 now detectives stationed out of Bangor. So with that, we do have a short presentation. I'd like to just work my way through. It is in your binder, so I'll try to be as efficient as possible with your time. But I thought it would be helpful to start out with some definitions. The Family Assistance Center, defined as is emergency management practice where secure facilities are established 24 to 48 hours after a major incident and provide crisis intervention, psychological first aid, needs assessment, child forensic interviews, personal effects return, and community service referrals to victims to include the deceased next of kin, families, injured, and present but not injured. In a nutshell, the FAC serves as a one-stop shop for services for the affected population. Depending on the incident, different agencies may be responsible for FAC activation, while the FBI and the American Red Cross often support lead agency, which would have been the Maine State Police for this incident. Law enforcement investigations to include interviews and evidence collection may be ongoing at the FAC as it was with this case. The FACs are a continuation of victim services, which are started during the initial response. The FBI Victim Services Response Team, we love our acronyms, FBI VSRT, is a rapidly deploying team comprised of victim specialists who work directly with FBI special agents and serve as critical link to ensure victims of crimes are connected with necessary critical support services and and resources while supporting the lead agency. And again, for this incident was the Maine State Police. Is there any questions over those definitions? I'm sorry to be so quick, trying to be efficient. Thank you, sir. So the assignment to the FAC, the Family Assistance Center, on October 27th, I was notified by Lieutenant Darrin Crane that myself and 3 detectives, 3 members of my team would be reassigned from the Central Maine Medical Center where we have previously been working to the Lewiston Armory, which is located in Central Ave in Lewiston. I was advised that I was going to become the Director of Victim Services for the Maine State Police, and Lieutenant Crane was going to be the OIC providing support to us. I will say this came as a little bit surprised as this is not something I had ever done before. I am a criminal investigator supervisor, so we had some conversations and Lieutenant laid it out very well for me. The primary objectives of my job was to ensure effective communication between agencies responsible for the activation of the FAC by identifying the partner's needs, coordinating and managing resources, and ensuring task completion as part of the existing ICS system, which you just heard about. Also in coordinating the ongoing MCU investigation at the FAC by including doing field interviews with witnesses and victims and collecting evidence as needed. I'm not sure if you folks are familiar or not, but the Lewiston Armory located at 65 Central Ave. This is a very robust building. It's a very good facility for this sort of activity. It's a little bit dated, some of the facilities, the restrooms and such, but it had wide open spaces, which were very, very helpful. And also it had a lot of small private rooms, ready rooms that were very, very beneficial for us. So it was a good venue. There were some complicating things later on, but we'll discuss those in the lessons learned. So the FAC partners, in general, there are so many partners and people that helped make this FAC come together. I can't list them all, but these are the major partners. Was obviously the Maine State Police, the Maine Attorneys General, the Red Cross, the FBI Victim Services, the Androscoggin County District Attorney's Office, the City of Lewiston, and various other stakeholders and non-governmental organizations, NGOs. So here's a summary of some services provided. As soon as people walked into the facility and they went through a law enforcement checkpoint to provide a sense of safety for everyone, because obviously everyone was very concerned. They walked in and they were met and they got a needs assessment completed. And that needs assessment included trying to find out what their relationship, what their correlation was to the incident. If it was found that it was not appropriate for them to be at the FAC, they were referred to the Ramada Inn in Lewis, which could provide services to them. So along with the introduction, the needs assessment, there was introduction and connections with the victims advocates who were on site. People were provided vetted factual information related to the incident, crisis intervention and psychological first aid with mental health professionals, child forensic interviews with child victims and witnesses, personal effects information, identification and return, community service referrals, and further law enforcement investigation in the forms of interviews with victims and witnesses. If someone came into the FAC and they said they had either not been interviewed by law enforcement or they had further information, that was something that we were very protective. We had detectives on standby and they would take those people to a private room and have conversations with them. So here are some key facts related to the FAC. After about 4 days, myself and Lieutenant Crane were relieved by, and also my detectives, Chris Foxworthy and Detective Larry Anderson, were relieved from our duties by Detective Sergeant Jason Andrews and Lieutenant Christopher Tremblay of MCU Central. The FAC remained open for a total of 6 days between October 28th to November 2nd, and the FAC ran from normal business hours. I was privy to receive some information and reports from the American Red Cross and also from the FBI, and from their reports, I gleaned some of this information. The American Red Cross and their teammates provided mass care and individual disaster care services for community partners and 155 clients while at the FAC. The Red Cross had deployed 109 people in a workforce to Lewiston. Many of those were in support of the FAC. The Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit North, specifically my team, conducted 7 interviews with witnesses and victims at the FAC. This included several members of the deaf community with the assistance of FAC deaf interpreters who were on site from the day we opened the door. The FBI Victim Services Response Team provided and facilitated service to 214 victims. And those victims were classified as injured, deceased, next of kin, present but not injured, business, secondary, family, friends, and others. The FBI Victim Services collected 475 items of non-evidentiary personal effects, PE, from the Maine State Police and the Medical Examiner's Office in Augusta. 462 items were cataloged, cleaned, and returned or released. 13 items were destroyed per request. And I've since learned after preparing this that there were several items that were not identifiable as far as they were not able to identify the owner. Those items are being continually held by the Maine State Police. This is where I would move into the lessons learned. But I'm not sure if I should take any questions before I go into lessons learned or.
Well, we're getting close to quarter of, so perhaps not.
Okay,
I think maybe we ought to just suspend at this point and let you do the lessons learned, and then I'm sure there'll be some questions that will follow.
Very good, sir. Thank you very much.
Confident of that fact.
Yeah, I'm confident of that as well. Thank you. So FAC lessons learned. Stakeholders, including the Maine State Police, face challenges due to simply not knowing the other stakeholders. But we clearly defined our clear roles and responsibilities, and this led to a very smooth operation overall. Stakeholders face challenges of opening the FAC during the disaster response phase prior to the locating of the suspect on 10/27. This raised significant concerns about public safety. As you can imagine, with public safety, we had to weigh out the balance of providing services and bringing a large quantity, a large population to a condensed area, which we were not confident that we could provide security for. There were some long conversations that were happening. However, all those conversations were able to conclude once the recovery phase happened after the suspect was located and the FAC was promptly open the following day on the 28th. The FAC location, the Armory, had previously been used as a family reunification center during the night of the incident. Having witnesses and victims return to the same location, unbeknownst to us, caused them stress. And when they returned again to provided services, and that was something that we were not aware of that until was brought up later on. And then with the closure of the FAC on November 1st, community partners developed a tentative plan to open a Community Resiliency Center, CRC, at the Peck Building in Lewiston. And that did open on the 13th of November. The CRC was managed by the Lewiston nonprofit Community Concepts, a community action agency serving Androscoggin County. The CRC will provide support services for victims, survivors, first responders, and families impacted by mass violence.
I would suggest we break now for lunch. Is an hour appropriate? It is for us, I'm sure, but we'll turn you loose on the city of Augusta. You see if you can get fed within an hour and get back. So we'll resume at 4:15.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.